The moment my daughter told me I was being moved somewhere safer, I looked her in the eye, smiled, and said, "All right, sweetheart." What I didn't tell her, what I'd been keeping to myself for 31 years, was already sitting in a file at a law office 12 miles away, with her son's name on the front page. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Frank. I'm 67 years old, and I spent 32 years building a landscaping and irrigation company from a single truck and a worn-out hose reel into something that fed 4 families and employed 11 people at its peak. My wife, Norma, ran the books from our kitchen table for most of those years. She had the kind of handwriting accountants dream about, small, precise, perfectly spaced, and she could find a billing error in 60 seconds flat. We built that business together the same way we built everything else, quietly, steadily, without much fanfare. We had one daughter, Vanessa. She was 26 when she married a man named Pierce. I'll be honest with you. I didn't dislike Pierce the first time I met him. He had a firm handshake and he laughed at his own jokes, which I've always found oddly reassuring. It wasn't until about a year into the marriage that I started noticing things. The way he'd steer conversations toward money without seeming to. The questions he asked about the business. Once at Thanksgiving, he asked me point blank what I thought the property was worth, meaning our home, a 4-bedroom craftsman on 2 acres outside Asheville, North Carolina. And when I gave him a vague answer, he pressed, not rudely, but he pressed. Vanessa didn't notice, or she didn't want to. Norma noticed. She told me that night in bed, voice low, "That man is counting something every time he looks at you." I told her she was reading too much into it. That was my first mistake. The business sold in 2019. It wasn't a sudden decision. I was 63, my knees weren't what they were, and an outfit out of Charlotte had been circling us for about 2 years. The offer was fair, better than fair, honestly. Norma and I sat at the same kitchen table where she used to do the books, and we talked about it for 4 evenings straight before we signed. We cleared enough to pay off the house, set some aside in accounts I won't discuss in detail, and keep a comfortable cushion that would last us well into old age as long as we were sensible. Pierce found out the amount within 2 weeks. I never told him. I never told Vanessa a specific number either. To this day, I don't know who talked. Things shifted after that. Not dramatically. That's the thing about this kind of slow rot, it doesn't announce itself. Vanessa started calling more often, which I should have appreciated, but instead made me uneasy. The way you get uneasy when the weather changes, and you can't quite explain why. Pierre started coming around on weekends, helping me with small things around the property. Fixing a gutter, splitting some wood I'd been meaning to get to. He was pleasant, helpful, and the whole time he was helping me split that wood, I could feel him calculating square footage. Norma's health started declining in early 2022, nothing sudden, a creeping series of small things that added up. Fatigue, then some balance issues, then a diagnosis that I'm not going to get into because it isn't the point, except to say that it changed the weight of every day. She needed more rest. She couldn't drive anymore after March. By summer, she was spending most of her time in the back bedroom that faced the garden she'd planted 20 years ago, and she'd lie there in the afternoons, watching the light move across the yard, and that was enough for her. She never complained. Pierce started talking about the future around that time, always couched in concern. He'd say things like, "Frank, have you thought about what happens when Norma needs more support than you can give her at home?" Or, "The property's a lot to manage for one person." Or my personal favorite, "Vanessa worries about you both being out here alone." Vanessa had not expressed this worry to me directly, not once. I let it go. I kept letting it go. That was my pattern. Absorb the comment, feel the irritation, say nothing, move on. Norma used to say I had the patience of a fence post and the stubbornness to match. She was right on both counts. In the fall of 2022, Pierce came to me with a proposal. He'd written it up, actual printed pages with headers. It outlined a plan for me to sign over a portion of the property's equity into a joint account that he and Vanessa would manage, which would then be used to fund Norma's care and future estate planning. He explained it calmly, sitting across from me at the kitchen table in a button-down shirt, like he was presenting to a client. I read every page. I said I'd think about it. I did not think about it. What I did instead was call my attorney, a man named Gerald, who I'd worked with since 1998, and I read Gerald the relevant sections over the phone. There was a long pause when I finished. Then Gerald said, "Frank, that's not estate planning. That's a transfer of control." He asked me if I wanted to take steps. I said I did. What Gerald and I put together over the next several months, I won't detail completely here. But the core of it was a revocable living trust, structured carefully with my grandson Oliver, named as the primary beneficiary. Oliver is Vanessa and Pierce's son. He was 9 years old at the time. The trust held the property and the majority of the liquid assets. The term specified that neither Vanessa nor Pierce could access or administer those assets under any circumstances. Only Oliver, upon turning 25 with a trustee I selected, a woman named Patricia who'd worked with Gerald's firm for 15 years. The trust was signed, witnessed, and recorded on a Thursday afternoon in February 2023. Gerald's office held the originals. I drove home and made a pot of coffee and sat with Norma in the back bedroom and watched the last of the light leave the garden, and I didn't say a word about it. It felt like setting a mousetrap and then going to bed. 31 years of marriage teaches you something about timing. The confrontation came faster than I expected. It was a Saturday in April. Vanessa and Pierce had come for what they said was a regular visit, but they'd arrived earlier than usual, and Pierce had his laptop bag with him, which he never carried on casual visits. Norma was having a hard day. She'd slept poorly and her hands were unsteady. So she stayed in the bedroom. I made coffee. We sat in the living room. Pierce opened with the property again. He said they'd been speaking with a financial advisor, someone I'd never met, never agreed to include in any conversation about my finances, and this advisor had some strong concerns about the tax exposure I was carrying. Then he slid a document across the coffee table. It was adorable power of attorney, with my name already typed in, naming Pierce as my agent. I looked at that document for a long moment. I remember the sound of a mockingbird outside. I remember my coffee cup was slightly too hot to hold. I said, "Where did you get this?" Pierce said, "Gerald's office prepared it." That was a lie. Gerald would no sooner prepare that document than he'd hand my wallet to a stranger on the street. I knew it was a lie, and Pierce knew I knew, and for a few seconds we just sat there with that knowledge, sitting between us on the coffee table next to the document. Vanessa said, "Dad, we're just trying to protect you." I looked at my daughter. She had her mother's eyes, same shape, same color, and she was looking at me with something that might have been genuine worry or might have been rehearsed worry, and in that moment, I honestly could not tell the difference. That was the saddest part of the whole thing. Not document, not Pierce. The fact that I was sitting there looking at my own daughter and not knowing whether she loved me or whether she'd let herself be convinced that taking from me was the same as caring for me. I said, "I need some time to look this over." Pierce said there was some urgency. There often is with people like Pierce. Urgency is how you stop people from thinking. I said, "Give me the weekend." They left around 2. I listened to their car back out of the driveway. Then I went and sat with Norma. She'd heard some of it through the bedroom door. She reached over and took my hand and said, "How bad?" I told her, "Not all of it, but enough." She was quiet for a minute. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Nothing right now, the trap's already set." She looked at me. I squeezed her hand. She understood me well enough to know I wasn't being reckless. What happened next, I didn't see coming. I should have, maybe, but I didn't. The following Friday, Pierce called and told me he'd made an appointment for Norma at a memory care facility in Hendersonville. He said a doctor, again, one I'd never met, had recommended an assessment. He said it calmly, helpfully, like he was doing us a favor. I told him Norma had a doctor. I told him Norma's doctor had not made this recommendation. I told him to cancel the appointment. He said, "Frank, I really think you need to consider." I hung up. That weekend, Vanessa came alone. Pierce wasn't with her, which surprised me. She sat in the living room, and for a few minutes she was just my daughter again. Tired looking, picking at the hem of her sleeve the way she used to do as a kid when she was nervous. She said, "Pierce thinks it would be better if you weren't here alone." I said, "I'm not alone. Norma's here." She said, "Dad?" That word, the weight she put into it, like I'd said something absurd. I said, "Vanessa, I need you to hear me clearly. I am not signing anything. I am not having Norma assessed by a doctor she's never met, and I am not going anywhere. This is my home." She left 30 minutes later. She hugged me at the door. Held on a little longer than usual. I don't know what that meant. 3 days after that, I got a certified letter from an attorney I'd never heard of. The letter referenced a petition for guardianship. It alleged, in careful, qualified legal language, that I was showing signs of cognitive decline and was unable to manage my affairs or provide adequate care for my wife. I sat at the kitchen table and read that letter twice. Then I called Gerald. Gerald had a different kind of quiet than usual when I told him. Not alarmed. Gerald doesn't alarm easily, but deliberate. He said, "They filed this in Buncombe County." He asked me some questions. He told me not to respond to the letter directly and to say nothing further to Pierce or Vanessa about the trust. He said, "Let them proceed. They don't know what they're walking into." The guardianship hearing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. 8 weeks is a long time to sit with something like that. I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights I lay awake going over the details, checking the math, wondering if I'd missed something. There were afternoons when Norma would ask me to read to her from the novel she was working through, and I'd read 3 pages and realize I hadn't taken in a word of it because I was running scenarios in my head. The worst part was watching Vanessa in those weeks. She came by twice. Both times she was careful and pleasant and asked about Norma's appetite and the garden. And I made coffee and answered her questions. And we sat in the same living room where Pierce had slid that power of attorney across the table. And I thought, this is my daughter. This is the little girl I drove to the emergency room at midnight when she had croup, the one who cried for 40 minutes because a bird flew into our sliding door and died, the one who called me from her college dorm at 11 p.m. because she was scared and didn't want her roommate to know. And here we were. The hearing was on a Wednesday. Gerald had prepared extensively. The trust documents were entered into the record. Gerald had brought Patricia, the trustee, who provided her professional assessment. The petition from Pierce's attorney rested on the allegation of cognitive decline, an allegation that, as Gerald pointed out, was supported by no medical evaluation from my actual physician, no documented incident, and no evidence whatsoever beyond the word of a son-in-law with a documented financial interest in gaining control of my estate. The judge, a woman in her 50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked Pierce's attorney several pointed questions. I watched Pierce from across the room. He had his hands flat on the table, very still, the kind of stillness that comes from starting to understand that something has gone wrong. The petition was denied. Gerald had also filed, on my behalf, a motion flagging the falsified power of attorney. The one Pierce had claimed came from Gerald's office. That matter was referred for further review. Pierce's attorney withdrew from the case within 2 weeks. I don't know what transpired between them, and I don't need to. I drove home from the courthouse and sat with Norma on the back porch. It was a warm day for Asheville in May. Clear sky, mountain line to the west, the dogwood still hanging on at the edges of the yard. I told her what had happened. On, including the part about the trust, including Gerald's name, including Oliver. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You set that up 2 years ago and never told me." I said I didn't want you to worry. She said, "Frank," long pause, "that is the most romantic thing you have ever done." I laughed. I hadn't laughed in weeks. Vanessa called me that evening. She was crying. Not perform crying. I know the difference. She kept saying she hadn't known about the guardianship petition, that Pierce had told her it was just a legal formality, a precaution. I don't know how much of that is true. I probably never will. What I told her was this: I love her. I am her father, and I will always be her father. But I am not able to have Pierce in our lives right now, and if she needs to think about what that means for her own choices, I understand, and I will be here. She came to see us twice more that summer, alone. The second time, she helped Norma in the garden for about an hour, not doing anything ambitious, just sitting in the grass, pulling weeds and talking. From the kitchen window, I could see Norma laughing at something Vanessa said. I didn't know what. I didn't need to. Oliver is 12 now. He doesn't know about the trust. He doesn't need to know for a long time yet. What he knows is that his grandfather picks him up from his mother's apartment. Vanessa moved out of the house she shared with Pierce last October on alternate Saturdays, and we drive out to the property and walk the 2 acres, and I tell him the names of things. Trees, mostly. Wildflowers. The difference between a red oak and a chestnut oak. Small things. The kind of things you can only learn from someone who's been standing on the same ground long enough to know it. Norma is doing better than the doctors projected. Not dramatically, not miraculously, just steadily. She still watches the light cross the garden in the afternoons. She still finds billing errors that aren't there anymore because there's no business left to bill. Old habits. I'm not a man who talks about what I've learned, but I'll say this much. The 31 years I spent quietly preparing, quietly watching, quietly building something that couldn't be taken. Those years mattered, not because of the money, because of what the preparation said about what I believe Norma and I deserved. We deserved to grow old in our own home. We deserved to make our own choices. And if no one else was going to protect that, then I was. The trap was set before they even knew there was a game. I think about Pierce sitting across from me at that kitchen table, his hands flat and still, watching the judge deny his petition. He'd walked in certain. That's the thing I keep coming back to, how certain he was. And I understand why. On paper, I was an aging man with a sick wife, no business left to run, and no obvious defense. What he didn't account for was the 18 months I'd spent quietly, without fanfare, making sure that certainty would cost him everything. There's something people misunderstand about patience. They think it's passive. They think it means waiting and hoping. It isn't. What I did with Gerald in that office in February 2023 wasn't hope. It was work. It was thinking 3 moves ahead and accepting that I might never need those moves at all, which is the hardest part of preparation. You do the work knowing you may never see the payoff. You do it anyway because the alternative is leaving the people you love unprotected. That's the thing Pierce never had. Not really. He had hunger and he had nerve, and for a while those 2 things look a lot like strength. But hunger without integrity is just appetite. And appetite without judgment eventually drives you straight into something you can't eat your way out of. He didn't lose because he was unlucky. He lost because every step he took, the fake power of attorney, the physician he found who'd never met Norma, the guardianship petition built on nothing, required him to cut a corner, and corners have a way of adding up. By the time he sat in that courtroom, he was surrounded by them. Norma asked me once, after it was over, whether I was angry. I thought about that for a while before I answered. Angry at Pierce? Maybe a little, in the distant way you're angry at weather. But mostly what I felt was tired. And then, underneath the tired, something quieter. A kind of steadiness that comes from having done what needed to be done before it was urgent. I didn't win anything in that courtroom. I just collected something I'd already earned. What I want Oliver to understand someday, when he's old enough and the trust means something to him, is that what he's receiving isn't luck and it isn't a windfall. It's the result of a grandfather who thought carefully, acted with integrity when it would have been easier to ignore the warning signs, and refused to be maneuvered out of his own life by someone who counted on him being too old, or too trusting, or too tired to fight back. Those three things: doing right by the people who can't protect themselves, thinking past the moment you're standing in, and holding on when holding on is hard, those are the only things I know for certain that are worth passing down. The property is still ours. The garden still faces west. Norma still watches the light move across it in the afternoons. And on alternate Saturdays, Oliver learns the names of trees. That's enough. That's more than enough.